training is testing and testing is training. We've been hearing that quote for about 20 years now. And I, as a coach, I'm all aboard with testing. I have my athletes test every 30 to 45 days. One of their big tests, the big test that everybody gets nervous about, of course, is their FTP test. And there are several different ways to do FTP tests. Different coaches have different philosophies of how to do that. But what is an FTP test? An FTP test is basically, what you can do in a quasi-state effort, steady state, going steady, somewhere between 35 and 75 minutes. It's the ultimate metric of your aerobic engine, right? So that's what we're trying to understand is what can your aerobic engine do for about an hour? That's your diesel engine, right? That's, your oxidation of fats and carbs, all that great stuff. And I had an athlete just rock it out, and his test is fairly unique because he's a sprinter. So he has a very big anaerobic capacity. So whenever he does an FTP test, he's bringing a huge amount of anaerobic ability to the table. So how as a coach, how do I deal with that and understand this athlete and his how do I separate his anaerobic ability with his aerobic ability, and how do we proceed further? So jump in here and let's look at this great FTP test that this athlete I did, and he rocked it out. So let's look at the comments, which I always jump in. As he says, very happy with this 31-minute effort, left it all out there. 100%. Set goal was 275 average watts, pacing from 245 to 290, depending how my legs felt. Boy, did they feel good. About 67 in the test. I do an RPV evaluation. Quick glance at the watts. Let's go. I was one today. Now, here are this next two sentences. So everything that he said was fantastic. He could have left it at that, and this would have been a great comment, right? So his soul is on fire. He's ready to go. He rocked out that test. He crushed it. That's really important to me because it shows that he paced the effort really well. He crushed it, and he actually upped his FTP 20 points. But this next set of comments is really cool. Lactate in the legs were not the problem. I would say my respiratory system was the weak link. My lungs couldn't keep up with my legs. That was absolutely a great comment, okay? And so that helps me to understand how he's actually feeling on the bike and to make sure that the data that I'm seeing actually is what he's feeling. And so what's great about that comment is that I'm going to go through some charts and we're going to look and really examine those comments. But the athlete is really in tune with the body. He's not living in a fantasy world when he's out there on the bike. His mind is really reading his body well, which is something that, every athlete that comes to me, just by going through the comments, some athletes are, in a fantasy world when it comes to their body, and then some athletes are really dialed in, but it is something that I work with my athletes to really help them understand how they're, how to understand your body when you're out there doing maximal efforts, right? That's crucial to understand, right? How, when your legs start to burn, how long can you go, right? And so I want all my athletes to know that kind of stuff, all right? So let's jump in here. All right, so the test was 31-minute test. Now I'm going to go into and explain why I have him do a 31-minute FTP test. Explain that in just one moment. All right, so I really wanted him to be able to beat 225 average watts. He crushed it with 272 watts, RPE of 10, rate of perceived exertion. Did about 11.6 miles in that 31 effort. That's pretty cool. And then I sent 272 watts and an IF of 1.14. He crushed this test. Now, one of the first charts I always look at is every athlete is different. When you go do a 20-minute interval, just looking at me or looking at an individual athlete, that 20-minute interval, because of your body, because of your fast twitch, because of your slow twitch, because of other factors, physiological factors, your body uses different energy systems, to produce that effort. Okay. And so I love to look at these energy charts because I love to understand my athlete as an individual athlete, to understand their phenotype. Okay. So, like, we understand the concept of phenotype. A Jonas Vingegaard, the guy who just won the Tour de France, does not have the same phenotype as a Wout van Aert, right? Or a Matthew van der Poel does not have the same phenotype as a Wout van Aert. So if you just look at those two athletes, Van der Poel, Wout van Aert, Van der Poel has the edge on climbs less than 10 minutes. Wout van Aert has the advantage on climbs more than 10 minutes. Jonas Vingegaard has the definite advantage on climbs 20 minutes, 30 minutes, 40 minutes, right? And so all of that is phenotype, and all of that is the use of different energy systems to produce different results. And so for me as a coach, I really got to understand my athlete as a phenotype. And so that's why one of the reasons I love this chart that shows what is the anaerobic contributions, what are the aerobic contributions to efforts, okay? And so we can see this FTP test. He starts his FTP test low and he paces up. And so you can see, right? Look at all that anaerobic capacity. He is just blowing it up. Look at all that anaerobic contribution. Now, here's the problem. When you want to do an FTP test, you don't want that anaerobic contribution, right? Because what is an FTP test? It's not your how much anaerobic you can do in about an hour. It really tries to measure your aerobic engine. And FTP is just your metric. Like we have a VO2 max metric, right? We have a FTP metric that models your aerobic engine. So, they have thought about this a lot. And so Andy Coggan, when he first came out with that FTP test, what was it, 20 years ago when he first published that 20 years. When he first published this back in, March of 2003, there was that 5-minute effort. So when you go out and you want to do, like a 20-minute test, then you subtract 95% of that and, all that stuff to try to get an estimate of what you can do for about an hour. Andy puts in that 5-minute blowout effort. Why is that? Because he wants to strip, so this is the classic Andy Coggan FTP test, right? He wants to strip as much of the anaerobic as possible so that we're just looking at your aerobic engine. The problem is that 5 minute, it won't even work with sprinters. You really have to have them do, say, a 30-minute FTP test because they have so much that anaerobic capacity that distorts the test. All right. So that's the reason why. But this testing method that I'm using now, here's a great one. So this is an athlete with a very high anaerobic capacity. He's a sprinter. You can see all this that he left out there. Here's an athlete with essentially, he is all aerobic engine. He is all steady state. He is all slow twitch fiber. He has a real hard problem with these anaerobic bursts or, just going any anaerobic whatsoever. He has a real problem. And so his measurement was really good with this to get the idea of his aerobic engine. Now, how I test is I use special software in part developed by Andy Coggan. So back in 2003, Andy Coggan publishes, his 20-minute test with the 5-minute blowout. He has since worked with other people like, Kevin Williams, Tim Cusick, and they've developed another way, a more advanced way to model that FTP, a more advanced way to figure out what are your aerobic contributions and your anaerobic contributions, and then it actually models an FTP that's been stripped of your anaerobic contributions. So when I look at this, right, he has all of this to contribute. So what are we going to do? Next week, we're going to do a test which will help the model. We're going to go out and do a 3-minute all-out effort, which will help the model determine what are this athlete's aerobic contributions versus his anaerobic contributions to not only his FTP test, but all tests in general. And so we're going to do a special test next week that will model his FTP. So say, he did this effort was at 272 for that effort, do your 95%, all that stuff. So 265. Once I have him go do that 3-minute effort next week, that's actually probably will drop because that test, that mid-range test of 3 minutes is going to pull out that anaerobic effort. All right. Now, this is another great comment that he left was at the beginning. So he's like, my cardiovascular system, my respiratory system couldn't keep up with my legs. That is true. And we could see it in the data, right? So his power is going up. This is his power. This is his interval trend line. His power is going up. This is his heart rate. And so we can see from his heart rate, ideally would not only match what's going up, but actually would go a little bit higher, just a little bit of cardiovascular drift. But here we're seeing cardiovascular drift in reverse because this is a newer athlete to me. He's only been with me for a few months, and we are developing developing his metabolic efficiency. We're developing his cardiovascular efficiency. We're developing his muscular efficiency, right? We're developing those three big things, and we still have some work to do with his cardiovascular system, okay? So right now, we're doing a lot of great steady state efforts. We're really working on his body's ability to, metabolize energy. But then, next month or so in his plan, he's going to start to see some VO2 intervals, right? And that's going to help address this problem of, we want to grow his abilities, his body's ability to process the oxygen, all that great stuff. So in another month or so, he's going to start to see that type of work. That's where he is. So we've built him up, we've progressed him, we've layered him over several months, and now he's ready for some VO2 efforts, and which will, it makes his house bigger, right? So right here in this image, what we're seeing is that, if we think of a house, he is filling up the size of his house. He's a big man in this house. And so we need to raise that roof. And so that's exactly what we're going to do in this image. With this. We're going to raise the roof in, maybe a few weeks. I think I have it in his plan. So that was a great comment that he can identify that physically. Great comment. All right. Another thing I always look at the DFRC. I've explained this a lot. Dynamic functional reserve capacity. I've explained this a lot, and this shows you that he paced this really perfectly, and he had a lot to give at the end, right? He just died 1,000 deaths and really left it all out there for this 31-minute effort. Another thing that I like to look at, especially for FTP tests, because there is a cadence FTP. So if you go back and you look at the average cadence of, say, your last 10 FTP tests, you're going to get, an average FTP cadence, an average threshold cadence. So I always love to look at these cadences to get an idea of what his cadence is at threshold. And as we can see, he's a low cadence, high force right through here. And, this is kind of where he's set at. And so, all my workouts throughout the week have different cadence manipulations. We have some slow cadence work, fast cadence work, really super fast cadence work. So I do a lot of cadence work with my athletes, and we will continue to develop that. But I always look at this to understand my athletes, where their threshold cadence is. Where do they feel most comfortable when they're doing threshold work? Okay. Now, let's end this thing. And so, all I could say is that this athlete rocked it out. 31-minute FTP test, crushed it, was in a great mood at the end. That shows me that his pacing was perfect. And if you pace these things correctly, they should not be soul crushers. Rock it out. He did. So that was the comments, the mood, the energy that he had at the end. That tells me a lot, right? And so when I get the athlete that, is like, oh, this was horrible, I'm soul crushed and all this stuff, then, that gives me really important feedback as well. Okay, so here's another good one. Solid pacing strategy. He absolutely had a solid pacing strategy. He rocked it out. He started low and he did negative splits and he built through the FTP effort, which is what we want. He had a great cadence. Everything was perfect. And then lastly, as I would say to my athlete, he's like, guess what, right? That's a great comment that you made at the beginning about your respiratory system not being able to keep up with your legs. Great comment. Guess what? We have some VO2 work on the horizon. All right, hope that this was a little bit longer video. They seem to all be pretty long. I hope that makes sense. I'll have some links in my show notes about FTP and things like that. It's a really fun way to look at it, and it's a really great way to understand your phenotype, what kind of events that you would either race to your limits or race to your limiters or race to your strengths. It's a great test, and this was this particular test, and I've looked at hundreds and hundreds of FTP tests. This was a really good one. This really got my goat, and I was really excited to see that and really happy for the athlete. He's crushing it. He's doing great every single week. Take care.